Hey there, Agile Wolfpack. Welcome to another episode of Agile Bites. It's the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. I got a question for you, listeners. Are you ready to suck? Well, I hope so, because today we're going to be talking about vampire bats. Did you know that other than primates, vampire bats are the only animal we know of that actually makes friends? It's true. Most animals will only bond or travel with other animals that they're genetically related to. So their children, their mate, animals that are kind of in the immediate family, as it were. But vampire bats actually build friendships with other vampire bats that they aren't genetically connected to in any way. How does this happen? Well, it's pretty gross. It turns out that what vampire bats will do is if one vampire bat has a lot of blood for a meal and has some left over, it will share that blood with other vampire bats that it likes. How does it determine what vampire bats that it likes? Well, it's generally the bats that share blood with it. And so in vampire bat, social circles? Is there social media for vampire bats? Has anyone explored this? Maybe my company will take a look at that at some point. But in vampire bat social circles, what happens is that you share blood with another vampire bat, and the expectation is that bat will share extra blood with you as well, or during times when you don't have as much. The interesting observable thing about vampire bats, though, is they know what bats won't share blood. And so if they share their blood with a bat and that bat does not reciprocate when the tables are turned, then the bats quit sharing blood with that bat. And so there's sort of this community idea of we have a bond of trust here, and this trust is built around mutual expectations for mutual benefit. And if I'm doing something for you, but you refuse to do something for me, that breaks that trust. And then all of a sudden the dynamic is completely messed up. And now, you have bats that perhaps need blood that aren't getting it, and maybe bats that have a surplus of blood that have nothing better to do with it. I can't speculate on what you do with extra blood. Maybe some of you know more about that than I do. But the point is that even when we get to something like vampire bats, they have an element of trust. And this trust is built by consistent meeting of expectations. So this episode is not really about vampire bats, I'm sorry. It's actually about trust. It's actually about how to build trust, not only in your team and amongst your team, but between your team and the larger organization. A big reason that we started Integrity Inspired Solutions is because we saw a lot of broken and dysfunctional relationships as far as software development was concerned. Software development teams among the team members and the relationships between the teams and the larger organization. And we have developed a number of practices that revolve around trying to heal and restore those relationships, because we don't think that the traditional antagonism that exists between these groups has to exist. So we're going to talk about trust. How do you build it in your team? How do you build it between your team and the rest of the organization? And for this podcast, I'm going to focus on two main pillars. I'm not saying these are the only things necessary to build trust, but I am saying they are two very, very key things. And those two pillars are transparency and consistency. And I would argue that even when we're talking about our interpersonal relationships outside of work or outside of software development, these are still two central pillars of building, maintaining, and repairing trust: transparency and consistency. So first, let's talk about transparency. So one advantage vampire bats have over software developers is the trust element is immediately transparent. Everyone knows, are you a bat that shares your blood, or are you a bat that just kind of keeps your blood to yourself? Are you a selfish little vampire bat? Everybody knows, it's immediately visible. Blood is a thing you can see, it gets shared or it doesn't, and everybody knows. But in knowledge work, like software development, a lot of the things that we do and a lot of the things that we go through to get there are really invisible to anyone else unless we make it visible. If you walk into a room full of software developers and they're all typing away, what are they doing? Are they working? Well, maybe. They might be writing an email to their friends. They might be playing Quake. It's hard to know. A lot of the work that we do is invisible. So it's a harder thing to establish transparency than it is in some other fields, perhaps. And the current market trend is only making this harder. If your team is all remote, then they're not even in the same room to see what each other's doing, to talk on an informal basis, they're separated. And that creates another barrier to transparency. I really don't know, unless you choose to make it visible, I really don't know what's going on with you over where you're at. And then further, you have teams that have migrated to a highly asynchronous model, where maybe they're all working different hours, or you're in very different time zones. So most, if not all, of your communication is done asynchronously through instant messaging, through email, that sort of thing. You may have teammates that you've never spoken to in real time, much less face to face. And when this is what we're facing, those are all barriers to being naturally transparent. We have to work harder. And I'm not saying that all those arrangements are necessarily bad, but what I am saying is they do create overhead. They do create issues that you have to deal with. And when everyone is sitting in the same room, a certain natural level of visibility and transparency happens that gets more diffuse as you go remote and as you change your communication patterns to be asynchronous. So transparency is something that isn't going to happen naturally. That's one thing your team has to understand. You have to be intentional about it. You have to create transparency. Very few things about what you're doing are going to be visible unless you choose to actively make it visible. So what are some things we can do with our team to do that? Well, the first thing is obviously we want to make the work as visible as possible. And the converse of that is we want to make sure that if anyone is doing work, that it isn't hidden, that everything that our team is doing is visible. One of the easiest ways to do this is with some kind of Kanban board. That's one of the ways we do it. All the work that the team is doing is up on the Kanban board. And if any individual is doing work that isn't on the board, we have a conversation about that. Why is this work not on the board? Can we put it on the board? Now, obviously, not every single little activity team members might do is on the Kanban board. We don't have cards up there for people using the restroom or going to a regular meeting or things like that. But in terms of the work that the team is doing, the kind of work that builds expectations in other groups, we do make sure that that's visible. And that helps the team keep on the same page in terms of what everyone is doing. But it also helps the larger organization. A lot of times our clients will have read-only access to our Kanban board so that they can see in reasonably real time what work the team is doing, what's coming up, what's currently being worked on, and what we finished. Another thing, and I think this is really key for a lot of teams, is to make sure that your developers are working together on the same items as much as possible, as opposed to each person having their own individual pile of work to do that isn't directly connected to work that other people are doing. If you're unsure of whether that fits your team, just think about your daily stand-ups. The things that people are saying, are the things that they say, do they directly impact anyone else's plan for the day? If the answer is no, you might have a team where everyone kind of has their own little work fiefdoms that they're working on, but they're not really working together on the same things. So how do we do that? Well, we can swarm. We can put as many people on one card as possible, for instance. We can also pair program. We can even mob program. These things mean that you can't be as asynchronous as perhaps you might want to be, depending on the direction your team is going. But that's the thing, right? Asynchronicity creates a lot of overhead when it comes to creating trust. But if your developers, if all your team members are focused on the same thing, if we're all working on the same card together, maybe I'm doing the database tables and you're doing the API endpoint, or we're pairing up on things, or we're mobbing up on things, everybody has immediate transparency into what everyone else is doing, how it's getting done, and what people are going through to get it done, because you're going through it together. And there's a lot of other benefits to this besides that. But building trust through transparency is one of the things that happens. There is nothing that builds trust faster than developers having to depend directly on each other and being in the same boat in terms of getting something out the door together. Another thing that you can do, this is more about building trust with the larger organization, is have frequent sessions with your stakeholders where you are planning the work to be done and you are getting their feedback on the work that you have done. At Integrity, our default is we plan with our stakeholders at the beginning of the week, and we have a demo/feedback session with them at the end of the week. Now, some clients, that cadence is a little too aggressive, so we might make it every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. whatever's going to fit our client's capacity to communicate with us on that. But the point is that we always want them to know what the team is doing. And we always want them to see in very tangible ways what we're producing, give us feedback on that, and see the results of their feedback being integrated in with the product. If you have that cycle set up with the rest of your organization, the amount of trust goes through the roof. And you will find that the rest of the organization becomes a lot less picky about things like deadlines. A lot of times deadlines and status meetings are really because of that lack of transparency. And so your stakeholders or your organization feels like they need to control it. Like that control is how they get their transparency. Well, the more we bring them into the process, the less they're going to care about stuff like that. If people see that every week my team is delivering something and every week we took their feedback and we changed the product in light of what they told us they needed, that builds an insane amount of trust. And now all of a sudden they don't need the deadlines. They know the software is coming. They don't need the status meetings. They know the software is coming. They know we're taking them seriously. They know they have a voice. So that's a very, very powerful thing. Another thing you can do is communicate a service level expectation. This is something that comes out of the Kanban community. If you don't know what an SLE is, check out the Kanban guide. It has more information on that. But basically, an SLE is some kind of advertised throughput rate. So for instance, your SLE might say something like 85% of items will be completed in 13 days or less. That's an example of an SLE. And you just have that published somewhere, either electronically or on a poster outside your cubicle or whatever. The SLE is an expectation. It is not an agreement, right? It is basically just a report on how fast things are going. Now, whether this SLE gets used by anybody or not, whether they do any math with it or not, that's another story, but often just the presence of it builds trust. Just having that information radiator builds trust. It's an incredible amount of transparency into your operations, and people respect that. Your other vampire bats will appreciate the reciprocity that you're showing by putting that kind of information out there. And then there are a couple of things that are maybe not quite as concrete that you want to take into account. The one thing is, if there's bad news, don't sit on it. Be proactive. Get bad news out there as quickly as possible. Your metrics and your forecasting strategy will help a lot with this. If I think a deadline is unrealistic, or if I thought it was realistic at the beginning, but I don't after a couple of weeks, I want to tell people that after a couple of weeks. I don't want to tell them 2 weeks before we miss the deadline, because it's a very different conversation to say, hey, when we planned this, we thought we would be done by the end of April, but that just does not look likely anymore. Having that conversation several months in advance is very different than having that conversation a couple of weeks in advance, which is when most teams usually have that conversation. When you have that conversation a few weeks in advance, people feel betrayed. They feel like you've hidden something from them. And now they're in a position where you don't really have a lot of viable options to do something about it. You're not going to want to add people. That'll just make you later, right? Whereas if we have that conversation months in advance, we have a lot more options. Maybe we can redirect some of that work to another team. Maybe we can add people, and now we have enough time that they will get ramped up and their addition will be an asset to our delivery as opposed to a drawback. Just don't sit on bad news. Be proactive. As soon as something goes wrong, tell somebody, say something about it. By the way, this is very true in our personal relationships as well. And finally, on the topic of transparency, I would recommend being a leader in being vulnerable. Sometimes I tell people to fall on their own sword. This is especially true if you're a scrum master or a team lead in some way. If people on your team do not seem to be comfortable being vulnerable, especially about bad things, you may need to be the first person to do it. Now, how do you do that? You might be thinking, well, bad things don't happen to me. I don't ever have anything to be vulnerable with my team about that's negative. Well, then pick something that is just mildly negative and make a thing out of that. I'm not suggesting that you make something up. Obviously, if you're trying to build trust, fabricating information is not the best way to come out of the gates. But just think about something. Think about something that you wanted to get done yesterday but didn't get done for whatever reason. Tell your team that. Say, hey, I planned to get this thing done, but I really didn't. I planned to have our retrospective planned out, but I am not ready. Tell your team the times that you struggle. Tell your teams the times that you fail. Tell your team the times that there was an expectation that you would have done something, but you didn't. You failed in some way and you apologize. These are very powerful things for a team to observe, because when they see you going out there and being transparent and being vulnerable, and that becomes normal and that becomes okay, and nothing bad happens to you, then they will follow suit eventually. That will fall. It may take a while for them to feel safe, but when they see you do it, when they see other people doing it, that's what creates that sense of safety. That's what creates that sense of trust. And then they will participate in it, which only further builds the feelings of safety and trust in your team. Again, you may be fighting some very powerful cultural forces here. It may take some time, but if you don't do it, then no one is going to do it. So definitely take the initiative, even if it might feel uncomfortable at first. The second pillar I want to talk about is consistency. We talked about transparency, but I want to talk about consistency. When vampire bats don't share their blood, when they don't meet that expectation, the other bats get leery of them. A big thing that I go out with in terms of selling integrity services, or even things that I talk about on LinkedIn or even this podcast, is predictability in delivery. And sometimes I get a lot of grief for that. People will say, well, if you're predictable in your delivery, you're probably not being very innovative. Or if you're being predictable in delivery, now you're a feature factory. People are just cogs in a machine. And let me tell you, none of that is true. But I understand why people say it. The reason that I focus on predictability is not because predictability is inherently good. It's because it builds trust. It's because it allows us to consistently meet expectations. There's a project that I'm involved in where someone else is the developer. It's a DeFi project, and this person has not learned this lesson. They continue to give deadlines for things that they continually miss. They keep saying, oh, this is going to be done by the end of the day. And it never is. Oh, I'm going to get that done this weekend. He never does. Now, all the delays are completely understandable. This is the way software development goes. We're always wrong with our estimates to some degree, seems like. It's perfectly understandable. He's not doing anything bad or wrong. He's a fine developer. But what happens is he keeps setting the expectations and then keeps failing to deliver to the expectations. And even when there's perfectly rational explanations for that, if your only consistency is that you are consistently failing, people are not going to trust that, right? So what do? Well, one thing I recommend is that you keep metrics and use data to make your forecasts. I have other podcast episodes about this. Feel free to reach out if you're unclear on how to do this. But keeping your throughput data and doing things like using Monte Carlo to make your forecasts, or at least at the bare minimum, at least looking at your historical rate of delivery as a basis for what your projected rate of delivery is going to be, that's very important. And if you aren't keeping those metrics right now, you should. It's very important that you forecast off your actual delivery rate and not sitting around asking people like, how long do you think that's going to take? How much do you think we can get done in the next 2 weeks? We're all going to be wrong about that if it just comes down to what we think or our opinions. The other thing that I would do is I would communicate any forecasts in terms of probabilities, not certainty. Don't tell people, here are the things we're going to get done in the next 2 weeks. Tell people there's an 85% chance that these are the things that will be done in the next 2 weeks. Not only is that more realistic, because we are guessing, no matter how good your forecasts are, we're still guessing. The reality is any forecast has probability attached to it. Any forecast can fail. And so we want to be realistic about that. We want to communicate about that. But that also then begins to change the nature of the expectations people have for our team. If the weatherman tells you there's a 70% chance of rain and it doesn't rain that day, you don't go, oh, that weatherman is so terrible. I can't believe they told me it's going to rain. The weatherman didn't tell you it was going to rain. They gave you a percent chance. And as we have the organization start to think about our software projects in that way, in terms of probabilities as opposed to certainties, then not only are you giving them better forecasts, but their expectations of your team are changing. Now their expectations are shaped around what is likely to happen, but not what is guaranteed to happen. This is a huge mindset that communicating in this way begins to change. And this improves trust, because when you do fail, when those probabilities fail, maybe is too strong a word, but when those probabilities don't work out in your favor, when that 15% comes up, it's only going to be 15% of the time, right? And people will just learn to take that in stride because we talk about these things in terms of probabilities, not certainties. Another thing you can do is when you make forecasts, make sure you are updating them regularly. I update our clients every week or every 2 weeks with brand new forecasts on how things are going so that they are always seeing how things are changing. And usually I have a little bit of commentary as to why that is. The next thing you can do is be very careful about how your team takes on new work. Don't let people talk to individual developers and hijack them to get their report done or whatever. And be very, very careful about your team pulling a new task or pulling a new feature. Have policies around that. Make sure that this is something that you enter into with eyes wide open, because when you're a software developer team, the biggest threat to meeting your expectations is not changing requirements. It is the amount of work that you take on at any given time. That is by far and away the biggest threat to your team failing to meet expectations. So be very careful about pulling new work and how often that you do it. Is your other stuff getting done? For example, are you pulling work faster than you're actually completing work? Look at those kinds of things and make sure there aren't these little weird loopholes that people can exploit to put new work onto your team's plate. Make sure there's a process, procedures, and policies around how that happens. The last thing I want to throw out there is to don't skip on quality control, because this erodes trust as well. Even if you're meeting delivery expectations, if your software is notoriously buggy or difficult to use, people are not going to trust you, right? And so don't skimp on that. Don't put stuff out there and then say, well, we'll just fix the bugs later. Or, gosh, I know this UX is really horrible and people are going to have a really hard time with this, but we'll circle back around to it. Don't skimp on the quality control. Make sure your UX is good. Make sure that it behaves as expected, because you don't want to put things in front of people that are going to break. Now, of course, this is just like missing expectations. This is going to happen from time to time, but we really want to try to prevent it as possible. Make sure you're doing your testing, you're writing your automated tests, make sure you've got acceptance criteria very well defined, and that all of those are being checked off, all that good stuff. So the two pillars, transparency and consistency. The very last thing I want to note, and we're going to go very quickly here, but I think it's very important, is that it takes exponentially longer to rebuild broken trust than it takes to build trust in the first place. This is something we all have to keep in mind. We have to keep in mind in our relationships as well. If you do something that breaks someone's trust, you should expect that there's going to be a long period of consistency and transparency before you get that trust back. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to take way, way longer to restore broken trust than it will be to build trust in the first place. So however long it took you to get that trust, just expect it's going to take way, way longer to make repairs. And the reason that I say that is because most of you are probably in situations where the trust level is already low. And it's probably low because of things that have happened in the past. And I just want to make sure that you have reasonable expectations that you are not going to be able to rebuild that overnight or in a week or in a month or maybe even 6 months, maybe even a year, depending on how much history has gone under the bridge. So just keep that in mind, but don't have that make you give up. You just need to have realistic expectations. When your team has been consistently knocking out of the park for months and your stakeholders are still trying to set deadlines and in kind of a command and control mode or whatever, don't give up, okay? It takes a long, long time to rebuild broken trust. And the way to do it is just to be very proactive about elevating transparency and consistency. Don't get discouraged and begin to cut back on transparency and consistency. Don't get discouraged and fight about the level of transparency that people want. Instead, be proactive. How can we be more transparent? How can we be more consistent? If that trust isn't there, then the direction you want to go is, how can I be even more transparent than I've been? How can I be unreasonably transparent? How can I be unrealistically transparent? How can I be so transparent that it puts me at a potential disadvantage? And how can I make sure that I'm consistent? When we say it, it's what happens. How can we make sure that we are more consistent, that we increase our consistency, that we are ludicrously consistent with the things that we say and the integrity that we build? Those are the ways that you rebuild trust, and it's going to take time. I hope this is helpful. I realize I threw a lot of different suggestions at you. Again, if you have questions about any of this or you want to hear a podcast that maybe does a deep dive into some of these things, please reach out. Please let us know. I'm happy to help. This is such an important thing for teams. I hope I've given you food for thought and inspiration, motivation, if nothing else. You can build trust. You can rebuild broken trust. It's all about the transparency. It's all about consistency. Folks, just try to be more like a good vampire bat. That's really what this is all about. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.